Welcome to the deep dive. We take those sources you send our way, boil them down, and try to get you the key insights, fast but deep.
Exactly. And today is pretty interesting. We've got audio recordings from 3 different pastors you sent us: John MacArthur, Noah Brayman, and Tom Pennington.
Right, and they're all tackling the exact same passage, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 to 24.
Yeah, it's a great setup. It lets us explore, the similarities, but also the different angles they take on these verses, see what really jumps out for each of them.
Okay, so our mission here is to kind of map out their core messages on this passage, see where they overlap and where they diverge.
Sounds good. Should we maybe start with the passage itself just to have it fresh in our minds?
Good idea.
Yeah.
So Matthew 6.19-24, it says, lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal.
But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal.
For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Then it continues, the eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light.
But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness?
And the final verse, no one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money.
Mm-hmm. Pretty stark contrast Jesus is painting there between, earthly stuff and heavenly priorities.
Definitely. And Tom Pennington really zooms in on this, particularly how it relates to materialism, to our things.
Yeah, he actually sees that whole stretch, verses 19 all the way to 34, as being about our response to material things.
Oh, interesting. So how does he break it down?
Well, he says verses 19 to 24 specifically highlight the dangers of materialism, and then the later verses 25 to 34 show how to, overcome those dangers.
Okay, dangers. So what are they, according to Pennington?
He pulls out 3 main ones, kind of summarized by those final statements in verses 21, 23, and 24.
Gotcha. So verse 21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What's the danger there?
Pennington calls that first danger being completely consumed by materialism. But what's interesting is how careful he is to clarify what Jesus isn't saying.
Like what?
He stresses it's not wrong just to be wealthy. He gives this whole list of examples from the Bible: Abraham, Job, David, even wealthy women who supported Jesus' ministry, Joseph of Arimathea.
Right. So wealth itself isn't the issue.
No. And he also says Jesus isn't knocking hard work or saving money. He even points to places where saving is commanded or shown positively. It's not about enjoying resources either.
So what is the problem then, according to Pennington? What does do not store up actually mean?
He says it becomes sinful when it's about selfishly hoarding, just piling up way more than you actually need. He uses this stark example of a millionaire woman who actually died of starvation because she was hoarding everything.
Wow.
Or, he says, it's sinful when you selfishly spend just on your own comfort, your own luxury. He points to that parable of the rich farmer in Luke 12 who just planned bigger barns for himself.
And didn't think about God or anything beyond himself.
Exactly. And the third thing Pennington flags is sinfully craving wealth that God hasn't given you. He brings in 1 Timothy 6 there about the danger of just wanting to get rich, that love of money being a root of all sorts of evil.
Okay, that makes sense. So why is storing up earthly treasure like that so bad?
Well, Pennington gives a couple of reasons. First, you just can't depend on it. Moths, rust, thieves. He explains how even clothes were a big investment back then, but still vulnerable. It's all fleeting.
Yeah, temporary.
And second, you can't take it with you anyway. He quotes Job, "Naked I came, naked I shall return," and 1 Timothy 6 again, "We brought nothing into the world and we cannot take anything out."
Yeah, that story about the businessman wanting to be buried in his Cadillac, right?
Yeah, kind of drives the point home, doesn't it? You can't take it with you.
So, after laying out what not to do, what's the positive command? Verse 20, store up treasures in heaven. How does Pennington say we do that?
He outlines 3 main ways. First and foremost, he says, you have to ensure you're actually going to heaven. That means justification by faith in Christ, not by works. He contrasts this with the Pharisees who gave money but weren't right with God.
Okay, foundation first. What else?
Second, invest in the advance of Jesus' spiritual kingdom. That means things like supporting missions and evangelism, investing in the local church. He mentions Philippians 4 and Luke 16 about using resources to buy friends for eternity.
Investing in kingdom work. And the third,
Invest in the needs of people. Just straightforward generosity, giving to the poor, meeting needs. He references Luke 12 again and 1 Timothy 6, saying even giving a cup of cold water counts.
so back to that first danger from verse 21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be. How does he unpack heart?
He explains it's not just emotions, but your whole inner self, your mind, your feelings, your will, your choices. Whatever you treasure, whatever you invest in most deeply, that's what captures your whole person and directs your entire life.
So it consumes you.
Yeah, consumes your thoughts, your time, your energy. He quotes a couple of scholars, Hendrickson and Carson, on this point. And he finishes that section with some pretty searching self-examination questions for listeners.
All right, so that's danger one, being consumed. What's the second danger Pennington identifies?
This one comes from verses 22 and 23, the analogy about the eye being the lamp of the body. He calls this danger spiritual blindness caused by materialism.
Okay, how does materialism make you spiritually blind?
He argues it works in several ways. First, it blinds you to the real value of spiritual things. You get so focused on the material, you just can't see the importance of the eternal. He uses the rich farmer parable again here.
The guy planning bigger barns instead of thinking about his soul.
Exactly. Second, Pennington says it can blind you to the true gospel. He points to the parable of the sower, the seed choked out by the worries of life and the deceitfulness of wealth.
And the rich young ruler, I suppose.
The classic example. He chose his wealth over following Jesus. Pennington also notes how wealth tempts people to trust in their riches instead of God.
Makes sense.
What else? He says materialism blinds you to its own destructive power. People chasing wealth often don't see the traps and ruin it leads to, like 1 Timothy 6 warns.
They think it'll bring happiness, but it brings trouble.
Right. And finally, he says it blinds you to what God has already provided. It fuels discontentment, always wanting more, and it can even blind you to God's spiritual provision, like his promise to never leave or forsake us, mentioned in Hebrews 13.
So, consumed by materialism, blinded by materialism.
Right.
What's the third danger from verse 24?
That's the impossibility of serving two masters. You cannot serve God and wealth. Pennington really emphasizes the exclusivity here. You will end up loving one and hating the other, or devoted to one and despising the other. There's no middle ground in terms of ultimate loyalty.
A stark choice. Okay, so that's Pennington's take, focusing heavily on the dangers. How does John MacArthur approach these same verses?
Well, MacArthur also sees the contrast, of course, but he immediately puts it into the broader context of the Sermon on the Mount. He reminds listeners that Jesus is constantly contrasting true, heart-level righteousness with the superficial standard of the Pharisees.
Okay. So for MacArthur, this teaching on wealth is another area where Jesus is saying, your righteousness needs to go deeper than the Pharisees.
Precisely. He actually describes the Pharisees as being very thing-oriented, greedy, covetous, manipulative, focused on getting more stuff. So Jesus is aiming these words right at that kind of mindset.
That's a helpful context. Does MacArthur focus on anything else specifically?
He emphasizes that this passage, verses 19-24, is primarily about how we view our luxuries and wealth beyond just basic necessities. And he makes the point that in a place like America, pretty much all believers need to wrestle with this because of relative affluence.
That's a challenging thought. He connects it to greed, too, right? Even inflation.
Yeah, he makes an interesting side point, connecting inflation back to greed as a fundamental cause, suggesting that dealing with covetousness in the heart is key.
So how does MacArthur structure his points on the passage itself?
He frames it around three alternatives or choices that Jesus presents in the text. First, the choice between two treasuries, earth versus heaven, based on verses 19 and 20.
Same core idea as Pennington invests in heaven.
Right. The principle is where your treasure is, that's where your heart will follow. He brings in 1 Timothy 6.92, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, and gives examples like Achan, Solomon, Ananias, and Sapphira, Judas, Demas, people whose love for earthly things led them astray.
Lots of cautionary tales there. Does he clarify what lay not up treasures on earth means, like Pennington did?
Yes, very similarly. He says it's not about forbidding everyday expenses, bank accounts, savings, or even owning things. He points out the commandments against stealing and coveting actually imply private property rights. God can grant prosperity.
So again, it's not about having things per se.
No, it's about the attitude. The problem is stockpiling, amassing way beyond use, hoarding luxuries for yourselves, that's selfish accumulation. He mentions covetousness being idolatry from Colossians 3.
Okay, so two treasuries. What's the second choice MacArthur highlights?
Two visions based on the eye analogy in verses 22-23. light versus darkness, or a healthy single eye versus an evil eye.
How does he connect the eye to treasure?
He says if your heart, which the eye illustrates here, is focused on God and heavenly treasure, you'll have spiritual perception, spiritual light. But if your heart is set on earthly treasure, the result is spiritual blindness, darkness.
And he digs into the Greek words here, too.
He does. He points out the word for healthy or good eye here is hapless, which can also mean single or generous. He links a single-minded focus on God with generosity.
Oh, interesting connection.
And conversely, he connects the evil eye with being grudging or ungenerous, referencing Proverbs. So for MacArthur, how you handle your money becomes a real litmus test for your spiritual vision. He even brings in Luke 16:11, if you're unfaithful with worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches.
Wow, that really ties generosity to spiritual insight. Okay, treasuries, visions. What's the third choice?
Two masters, from verse 24. God versus money or mammon. You simply cannot serve both. He emphasizes the word doulos, meaning a bondslave, highlighting the total allegiance required by each master.
They're fundamentally opposed.
Diametrically opposed, as he puts it. You have to choose. He quotes Bishop Ryle saying that singleness of purpose is the great secret of spiritual prosperity.
So, for MacArthur, a defining mark of someone truly in God's kingdom is this deliberate choice to invest in eternity.
Yes. He strongly suggests that if someone has zero desire to give unselfishly towards God's purposes, they should seriously examine whether their faith is genuine. It's about where your ultimate allegiance lies.
Powerful stuff. Okay, so we have Pennington's focus on dangers and MacArthur's focus on context and choices. What about Noah Brayman? What's his angle?
Brayman starts with a really potent analogy. He compares Christians to refugees.
Refugees. How so?
He says, like refugees leaving their homeland, Christians willingly give up the familiar comforts and securities of this world because they're pursuing a new kingdom, Christ's kingdom, and they actually find their joy in that pursuit and letting go of the old for the sake of the new.
That's a compelling image. How does he connect that to the text?
He draws a direct line between treasures on earth in verse 19 and money, or mammon, in verse 24. He points out that mammon originally meant something you put your confidence or trust in.
So not just literal cash.
Right. It came to mean material wealth, sure, but Brayman expands it to include anything we rely on for our security, maybe our reputation, our appearance, our job title, whatever.
Okay, and what does he connect treasures in heaven to?
He parallels that with serving God from verse 24. So for Brayman, whatever rules us, whatever we truly treasure, that is our master. It broadens the whole concept.
So it's less about money specifically and more about ultimate allegiance to anything other than God.
Exactly. He makes this ironic point, how we think we master things, like getting a master's degree, but often those very things we pursue can end up mastering us.
That hits home. How else does he develop this idea of treasure?
He connects it directly to the Great Commission, the call to make disciples. He argues that if Christ is genuinely our treasure, the thing we value most, then we'll naturally want to make him known to others.
Our treasure directs our mission.
Yeah. Our treasure influences our decisions, our actions, what we talk about, and it fuels that desire to see more people find Christ and join his church.
Does he bring up the rich young ruler too?
He does. He says the reason that young man was so sad was because he couldn't let go of his worldly treasure. It was his master. He was enslaved to it. Brayman stresses that Jesus refuses to let his people stay enslaved to the world.
And that clinging to other masters prevents discipleship.
Right. He puts it starkly. Refusing to have Christ as the only master means you can't actually be his disciple.
Brayman also talks about death, doesn't he?
Yeah, he uses the image of cemeteries, how they seem to symbolize death's victory over everything earthly, but then he contrasts that with Christ, who conquered death.
So if Christ is our treasure,
then neither we nor our ultimate treasure will face decay or ultimate loss. It's secure eternally.
And this motivates sharing Christ.
Absolutely. Because he is that ultimate secure treasure, and he is the one who rescues us from judgment. Brayman quotes Don Carson about how following Jesus involves actively training ourselves to love kingdom values, to delight in what God approves.
Learning to treasure the right things.
Exactly. And he also refers to 1 Timothy 6, like the others, but emphasizes how being rich in good works and generosity is how the wealthy store up heavenly treasure and take hold of true life.
So for Brayman, having Christ as treasure radically changes how we interact with worldly wealth.
Completely. It leads to selflessness, generosity, using money and resources in a totally different way than the world does. It impacts how we view our jobs, our bank accounts, our time, our attention, everything.
Okay, wow. 3 distinct voices, same passage. When you pull back, what are the big similarities you see across all three?
Well, they all clearly teach that this passage is a warning against prioritizing earthly wealth and possessions. That's undeniable.
And they all push for setting our hearts and focus on heavenly, eternal values instead of temporary, material ones.
Definitely. The concept of treasure is absolutely central for all three. This link between where we invest our stuff and our attention and where our heart and life are actually headed.
And that core message of verse 24, you cannot serve God and money. They all agree that's a fundamental choice of allegiance.
Yes, there's no splitting that loyalty. And another thing, each one uses the passage to really push listeners towards self-examination about their own attitudes toward wealth and their spiritual priorities.
So lots of common ground on the main thrust. But the differences in emphasis are really where it gets interesting, aren't they?
Absolutely. Pennington, he's very focused on the dangers of materialism. He meticulously categorizes them, gives practical tests. He's really careful about defining what storing up sinfully actually means and clearing up potential misunderstandings.
Very analytical and practical.
Right, whereas MacArthur frames it much more within that larger context of Jesus confronting the Pharisees' flawed system. His emphasis is really on the stark choice presented between the two treasuries, the two visions, the two masters. He brings in more Old Testament background and those word studies.
More theological context in the theme of choosing.
Yeah. And then Brayman comes in with that powerful refugee analogy. His focus is really on the radical nature of commitment when Christ is truly your treasure. He broadens the definition of treasure beyond just money and links it directly to serving God as master, impacting all of life, including our drive for mission and evangelism.
More focus on the all-encompassing nature of treasuring Christ and its missional outflow.
Exactly. So you get these different facets. Pennington gives you the detailed warnings, MacArthur gives the context and the fundamental choice, and Brayman gives you this compelling picture of total reorientation around Christ as treasure.
It really layers the understanding, doesn't it? Hearing all three, it makes it clear this passage isn't just like a simple command about money. It goes way deeper into our core values, our allegiance, what truly drives us.
For sure. It's about the heart.
So, for everyone listening, maybe the question becomes, which aspects of these perspectives clicked most with you? Pennington's warnings, MacArthur's focus on the choice, Brayman's picture of radical commitment.
Yeah, and how might those insights apply, practically? Where is your treasure, really? If you had to answer honestly, what does that reveal about your heart, about who or what is ultimately your master?
And maybe a final thought to sort of mull over this week, thinking about all three Pennington's dangers, MacArthur's choice, Brayman's call to treasure Christ above all. What's maybe one practical, concrete step you could take?
One thing this week to intentionally shift your focus, even slightly, more towards laying up treasure in heaven. What would that actually look like in how you use your time or your money or just what you prioritize day to day?